British painter Edward Povey is known to us. He's been followed throughout his career by the British Broadcasting Company Television and Radio, the Art Institute of Chicago, and has been shown by John Whitney Payson and many others in Europe and in the States. Throughout much of his career, though, his art was necessarily private by nature and ran against the mainstream. But in the last decade, his concept of his art metamorphosed, and he with it. This brings his ideas and his recent paintings very much into our debate today about the function of art now. And with that, I ask you to warmly welcome Edward Povey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very nice to have these two paintings here today. I'm pleased that they're with me because I know that you've seen them previously in the BBC article with the former head of arts and culture and the interview with the former head of the BBC. But I'm very excited that you get to actually see the paintings themselves rather than images of them. And we'll be talking about images in a little bit. But first, may I say a word to the artists among you? And that is that you may regard transformation and evolution as obvious and doesn't even need to be said. I think they are pivotal states for us, though, as artists. More now than ever, I think. And the reason I think that is that their opposite leads to fixedness. It leads to the making of products or artistic merchandise. And in a world of merchandise, I think that that has to be our first enemy. Don't you? And it's something to be very careful of, I believe. And I think that unless we are actually riskily evolving, I think we effectively disappear off the creative landscape. So that's the end of my sermon, the first sermon. My attitude to art and to painting in particular began, interestingly, as painting was said to be ending according to the hegemony of the art world, as it came down even through my unknown little college on the south coast of England. And so I couldn't learn painting there. I wanted to be a painter and they wouldn't teach me painting. Interestingly, there was a girl there in the college, a student, who used to set fire to her paintings in the courtyard, and she got to be on the painting course, which kind of annoyed me at the time. But it was a subversive act, I suppose, and I think even more subversive was me leaving the college, and it was a necessity. I wanted to paint at that time, and it's different now. I feel very strongly about painting, but more about a concept that I think is enshrined in painting. And it's a little hard to express, and that is that for me, I feel that the comprehension of concepts which appear or are symbolized in the visible world can only be represented by the infinitude of color, tonal value, and texture that occurs in pigment. And that it's only by rendering them, in my opinion, that we can handle them, that we can handle ideas. It's only by rendering them. Because without rendering them, I don't actually believe we see them. I think the whole purpose of drawing and painting always was quite simply a function of allowing us to see. So I found my voice as a figurative symbolist initially. And I just feasted on the influence of Baltus and Stanley Spencer, who brought that dark, erotic richness to these interiors with figures that resonated so much for me in my childhood. Well, an Italian museum curator, Giuseppe Bacci, said of my work, a couple of years ago, he said of my earlier work, that it is carnal in nature, that it is not violent per se, but that violence is perpetually in the wings, which really rather amazed me because, as far as I know, he knew nothing about my childhood, but his words absolutely summed up my childhood. And I'm actually very grateful for my childhood because it provided me with a sort of focused intensity that has served me extremely well in my career. It's a necessity, isn't it? And also it provided me with a big ego. And don't you think that that is an essential component of the bulldozer that allows us to make art? I think surrounded by these tendencies to look in the rearview mirror and paint self-consciously, I do think we need a soul like a bulldozer in the making of our art. So I evolved in that narrative, rather cerebral kind of work for 20 years. And then in the last 10 years, I'd exhausted it as a way of making art. And absolutely had to move on because I was changing and I wanted something less cerebral and more of a direct experience. It's the only thing that would speak to me and sew together my integrity with the art that I was making. And they've got to stay sewn together, haven't they? And I began to realize that my previous approach was didactic, that I was preaching to the viewer, and in that way, robbing my viewer of the guts of the experience, of actually robbing them of their part of the relationship, their response to my art, their valid response. And so I had to spring clean the narrative from my work in order to have any kind of relationship with my viewer. Because up until then, it's as if the viewer had turned up and I had said, oh no, thank you for coming, but the job's done, I've done the job for you. It's okay, you can come in and admire me, but there's nothing for you to do, basically. It's all done, it's okay. So I knew that the human figure would be central, but that it would lack narrative. And that's hard to do for a human being, because they occur together, I think. But this figure without a narrative quality resonated for me very much in my life, and also in the century in which I was born. It resonated with that. The reason that it resonated, I feel, is that I believe that we have been brutalized by the 20th century, 21st. Interestingly for artists, mainly by imagery. That is, crime scene photography, war photography and footage, and pornography. For all the good parts of all of them, and they do have good parts, I think that they brutalized our relationship with ourselves. And for artists, the sheer quantity of imagery brutalized us, which is pretty important, isn't it, for what we do? The thing that interested me more than anything was crime scene photography. it sickened me because I'd been threatened as a child that with being killed. And so it sickened me in that way. But it also fascinated me because what I noticed in those photographs was the discarded quality of the bodies, the thrown away quality. See, that was so close to a body having lost all narrative. To me, I liked the meaninglessness, the lack of intention in the position, interested me. So it affected the kind of models I needed to find very much. And I was looking, and these are the only words I could find to describe it, and that is, I was looking for distractedly prosaic-looking models that would sum up the feeling that I was looking for. And I started trying methods to capture them on film in some ways to transmit the idea that I had. What I wanted was a displacement from narrative, and the only method I found that worked was the use of visualizations. One visualization is enough to distract a person. I used about 3 in order to get them completely out of themselves, adrift in a sense. The second thing I found was that I couldn't control the physical positions, the postures of the models, unlike I had before. I'd controlled them in perfect detail, minute detail before, every little thing. And now it just didn't work, it looked contrived. So I had to change that. So I instructed the model in the parameters of the postures. I set up the camera on automatic and I left the room and allowed it to take 2,400 images, of which on average I found only a single image of the 2,400 would work, which I think is kind of ridiculous, really. Try harder. I mean, it must be possible out of 2,400 images to surely find those that would convince me, but they didn't. And I frankly don't know why it should be so hard to get what I was wanting, but it was difficult. The end result in the painted figures was a being that echoed a quality of the Mannerists, for one. I searched high and low for this, and I found it in Bronzino, just in a couple of postures and angles in Bronzino, and also in the Hellenistic Greek sculptures, there were 1 or 2. It wasn't their cause or their intention, so these were aberrations in those movements, but that's where I saw it. An unnerving release from purpose. You know the way it is when you actually stand back from your painting for the first time? It traumatized me. When I stood back and saw the result, it upset me. I had nightmares and panic attacks for about 6 months looking at these figures. And I think what it was that I hadn't anticipated that I would share the viewer's entanglement with my figures. See, I thought I was kind of released from that by being the artist. I didn't realize that it would embroil me as well so much. But having tasted that trauma, and also, I have to say, a certain amount of euphoria in the making of something so that remains so open, it burned my bridges, and I couldn't possibly return now to anything more fixed in a way of making art. My next problem was how to take the figure into pigment without losing human presence, and at the same time escaping Magritte's lie. You know, Magritte's famous "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," this is not a pipe, lie. That it will always be a painting, it will never be a pipe, it's a lie. I was terribly worried that my figure would never transcend paint, would never be a visceral experience, was worrying to me. And so I devised 4 different methods. It's interesting, isn't it, that the vision, your intuition, is so supported by engineering. So I devised these 4 methods as a way to escape Magritte's lie. One was to narrow the visual space, and I worked with the model and crammed them in a narrow space so as to limit the visual depth, thereby limiting the extent of the lie. I made a white lie, if you will. I limited it. Secondly, I made the figure very large because what I wanted was to overcome the figure's problem of being made of paint and make it that the observer would look at the figure and the figure would look back, causing a kind of equality. And it would need scale in order to do that, to overcome its problems, its limitations. I've always been interested in, and this is the 3rd method I used, I've been interested in David Hockney and R.B. Kittredge in the 60s, their analysis of style. Hockney was always interested in style. And I think that style once served a purpose and is a sort of limitation now in creating visceral experiences. And so my conclusion about that was that a single style gives, you might say, an accent to the painting, an accent that has a kind of inference on the interpretation, a suggestion of meaning, which I didn't want. It also ties it to the paint. So by using several styles simultaneously, by using several styles, I found I could render the styles irrelevant and overcome them by doing that. The final method was to put gaps in the body, remove limbs, ghost away the heads, put holes in the center of the body. And my reason for this was much akin to Michelangelo's Atlas slave or his dying slaves, where he had the warrior, the slave, climbing out of the stone and didn't carve the remaining part, left it as stone. I do the reverse. I paint the entire figure, but I then invade the figure. And my idea in this was that when someone stands behind a chair, you don't believe that they've been hurt and had their legs cut off. You have a belief in the integrity of the whole human body, and you cerebrally fill in the missing parts and continue in your calm sense of an entire human body. When an artist misses out sections of the body, the observer fills in the missing parts, and I believe that their knowledge of the human body, their belief in that, is better than anything that any artist could ever paint. But all along, I wanted an antagonistic second language that would invade the figures and debate with the figure, creating a kind of conversation. I studied the work of Franz Klein and Gorky, and also the hieroglyphics of Motherwell. What I was interested in with this was the primitive simplicity of their marks and the sophisticated orchestration of their marks. That is, we always thought it was action painting, done very emotionally. But it never was, in fact. It was completely orchestrated and engineered, as are mine. And I like that combination, the primitive and the sophisticated combined. I also like the fact that it doesn't lie. The paint, quite simply, is what it is, and it records the gesture of the artist, which then for every viewer plays back. I love the honesty of that. The abstract statements remind the figure then, you are paint. And the figure says back, admitted, but I engender belief. And it is this conversation that interests me so much. The BBC by turns have said about it that it's a seamless combination of languages on the one hand, and also that it's an inappropriate marriage on the other, which I quite like actually, it probably is. But like words and music, we've known it for centuries. So here's a sort of equation to sum up. At one time, I brutalized my viewer, I feel, by removing their rights. And I think the more we make the kind of didactic art now that preaches to the observer, I think we do remove their rights. We remove their whole purpose, actually, their interaction with it. Now I liberate my viewer and I brutalize my figures instead, which was never the idea. But I had to reduce them to the primitive material that lies behind the artifice with which we're normally defined. It had to be done to discover the part that remains unchanged, I feel, in a brutalized century. So my career transition, I feel, tries to accomplish two things. To orchestrate the paint, to get underneath the thinking, and to get to the primitive. And then I turn around and try to get the human presence to transcend the same paint. What a conundrum. Thank you very much for being here.